All right, we got a great show today. It's going to be Josh Reid coming on with us for the first time guest. So, Josh, I'm really freaking a big fan of yours, and it's a huge honor, and really absolutely love having you, my man. So great to have you on the first time. How you doing?
Gavin, excited to be here, man. I'm doing good. It's a beautiful day outside, and it's 11:11 right now where I'm at. So let's rock and roll.
Yeah. So I mean, I started following. I heard about you from Nino's Corner at I think it was back in like fall of this last year. I never heard of you before, and you were on some sort of a roundtable podcast with a bunch of people, and there was a bunch of people talking, and then all of a sudden you chimed in, and then you hit this like flow state of talking, and like in about 2 or 3 minutes, you just completely captivated the whole audience, and then all of a sudden people like Nino and other people are like, tell me more. Whoa. And then all of a sudden the conversation just kind of flowed to you. And then you were just like dropping bombs on people with knowledge and information about, your past, your story, your insight, like all that you're into, like, flow. I was like, oh my gosh, I gotta follow this guy, So, I mean, it was on a whole nother level. And these were high level influencer type people that you were on with. These weren't just nobodies, these
Yeah, it
were
was it was
respected.
Scott McKay, Jaco, Nino, and
Yeah,
myself. Yeah.
respected influencers, So, but you came on there and literally just dropped so much knowledge in such a short amount of time. I was so impressed that I started following you since then. So, my first time having you on. So, yeah, but I'm super curious. I'm really fascinated to know your story, So maybe you kind of take us back to like where you're, I know you're from Minnesota, but like what's the story of Josh Reid? Where did you grow
Yeah.
up and where did you start?
So grew up in Western New York, just outside of Rochester. Lived there till I was 19. Had a wonderful childhood. That's a joke. My parents did the best they could. But unfortunately, I dipped into drugs at a very early age. I got started smoking weed just to fit in at 12, started dropping LSD at 13, was dealing LSD by the time I was 14. Mushrooms, LSD, psychotropic drugs were my thing. I remember I went a whole 2 summers where all we did was every other day is we ate hits of acid and we'd just go to my buddy's farmland and just walk and be in nature and at that age it does something to the construction of your neural pathways of your mind, of the development of your mind. And I'm the lucky one. I will say that straight out, that with all the drug use that I had when I was younger, I look back now and like my friends, the it was a brother, two brothers that we would do this every summer. They're both deceased. They're both passed away, and my heart goes out to them. And they fell deeper and deeper into the drug hole. Luckily for me, I had an experience when I was 18, and it just changed my life on drugs. I just couldn't do it anymore. And it's not that I didn't want to, absolutely wanted to, but I just couldn't because it was producing certain levels of anxiety, and this was marijuana. So I decided to join the military. I went into the Navy, and I was hell bent on going under the nuke field. I wanted to become a nuclear engineer. I had the intelligence. I'd already gone through college. I had won the American Chemical Society Student of the Year 2 years in a row in college. Was taking AP classes in high school, even with a very, very low GPA. I had to get waivers to do that. So I excelled in science for some reason. I went to the Navy. I took what's called your NFQT, which is your Navy qualification exam or your Navy nuclear qualification exam. And I passed it with a 98%, which was unheard of. I got permission from them to get all the waivers because I didn't have the academic credentials to go in. I got all of that taken care of, and I was set to deploy. Go to boot camp about a year later on the delayed entry program. Well, this was September 7th, 2001. So when all of that happened, and the next Monday was September 11th, 2001, and I called my recruiter. I'm like, "Hey, what's going on? Can we speed this process up?" And he goes, well, we would have to get you out of the current job that you're set up for, the nuke field, if you wanted to go in. So why don't you come in and talk to us? I went in and he set me up in the advanced electronics computer field. It sounds all nice, but it's antiquated technology. And I ended up going in as a fire controlman, working on missile weapon defense systems, radar control systems, and what is known as the old school before the Aegis system came out is NTDS CDS system. So Naval Tactical Data Systems Combat Directory System. Became a subject matter expert in the Navy on that on board my ship. Um, Ran multiple different projects, became the head of my work center. It was great. I had a great time on the ship. We did counter-narcotic interdiction in the South Pacific. I was a member of the Visit Board Search and Seizure team. So I'd go out there with the Coast Guard lead-up teams and we'd intervene on drug traffickers and human traffickers that were obviously trying to smuggle it into the United States. And I had an experience during this time. It was about 200 miles outside of the Galapagos Islands when we were deployed down there. And we had a barge that we got on radar, and we get closer and you can see it's an open barge. So there's no roof, nothing. It's a gray deck ship on the middle of the equator, 120 degrees outside. So probably 140 degrees on the deck. And we get closer and we start noticing that there's people on the barge. And the people just happen to be children, ages 5 to about 13 years of age. There is a pregnant, like 12-year-old girl on there. There was one child who didn't make it, unfortunately, because they had been out there for 2 weeks with no food, no water. And we get them on board, and they're very skittish. They are very scared, but hungry, dehydrated, all this stuff. And we process them. And I'm trying to like rationalize what's going on here. And it comes to be that these kids were being human trafficked. And what ends up happening in South America, which is kind of an interesting twist, is that their parents believe that they're selling their kids to have a better life in the United States of America. So they raise money up $250. They pay these fishermen to take their kids to meet these handlers, which are going to get them to the United States of America. And once they get to the United States of America, they're going to have a better life because you get citizenship and you get benefits and all this stuff. This was back in 2005, 2006. And what actually happens is those fishermen take them on a barge, ship them out to a waypoint in the middle of the ocean, drop them off, and then leave them there. And then occasionally, the human traffickers will come out, hook up to the barge, and then take them inland to like Honduras or something. And then they will make their way up to the border of the United States of America and then cross over with the cartels leading and guiding them. The problem is 7 out of 10 of these barges are never found. So if you can imagine, 10, 20 of these leaving a week from port in, Ecuador or Colombia, it's just horrific to see that all of this life is being lost and wasted off of false promises, off of deception, and off of this apparent abhorrent evil that is in our world. And this experience really changed my whole life and perspective
So you're
of
well, hold
the
on. So
world.
so you're in the Navy and you're out at sea on a ship, and then all of a sudden you end up on a barge. You end up on one of these things, and you see.
So yeah, so we our ship came upon this barge and we noticed that there's little kids on board and we bring them on board and we had a Coast Guard law enforcement detachment on with us. And right when we brought them on board, we had DEA, CEA come on board, process these kids, get information out of them. But yeah, it was a human trafficking operation that was running out of the South Pacific. And this is what happens. They pull these barges out to the middle of the ocean. Human traffickers will come in, cartel members pick them up, and then drag that barge into land, and then they will make their trek from those areas, Costa Rica or whatever it is, all the way up to the US border. But the majority of these barges are never found. And I was horrified. Like I had this false perception that this world was a beautiful place. And I knew the United States was corrupt and everything like that. But I think that I had taken being American for granted highly until that time. And that's when I really started the research and dig into global conspiracy. Now, I'd already started that research many, many years before and read all of David Icke's books and read all of these other different books and, got into this whole conspiracy mindset, but it was nothing I really talked about openly. But after this moment, I realized the reality. I realized that this was not conspiracy. This was true. And this stuff was actually happening. And I started to just kind of deeper dive into the research and try to understand life a little bit more and why these things could come about, more of the psychological component and spiritual component of all of this.
Hmm. All right, so now timeline here. So, but you're in the Navy now. You're having this kind of awakening. Did you all of a sudden like leave the Navy and say I gotta move on, or did you? I mean, what happened? What happened with the Navy and then going into
Yeah,
your career? You graduate
so
college, I
no,
guess, before that, or did you stop college? I mean, because you said you went to college first.
I stopped college when I joined the military. I
Okay.
did some college in the military and then got out with the CU and got all that done. No, I did 6 years on that ship and then I left and I went to Washington, D.C. So my next duty station was Washington, D.C. And it was kind of interesting there. Got to see the Obama administration when they first came in, everything that was happening. It was a very dark and scary place. I was more interested at that time with esotericism. I was really deeply and trained within esoteric study. And so when I went to Washington, D.C., I mean, you got all of these landmarks, all of the symbology, all of these different things happening. And I used to go around on the weekends, start on Saturday, and I'd take the metro down to DC. And 8 in the morning, I would just walk around Washington D.C. making notes on all the symbology of all of the different statues, of all the different roads, of all of the different monuments, of the layouts of everything. And actually, there's a gentleman out there, William Henry, who wrote a book on this back in, like, I think it was 2009, 2010. And a lot of my, so I was in an email distribution list with Richard Hoagland, George Norrie from the Coast to Coast AM crowd. And that's how I met Lloyd Pye and collaborated a little bit with Lloyd Pye, but that's how I met William Henry and, sent him a lot of my notes and stuff like that, which was used in some of his content. So it was really, really cool to go out to DC and kind of see the esoteric symbology that is actually portrayed there. And it's not really what people think, by the way. It's not this evil Satanist configuration of Washington, D.C. It's not what it's meant to be at all. And I like to help people kind of see that differently because I spent a lot of time there. But then 2010, 2011, I got out of the Navy. I just couldn't do it anymore. There were some things that were happening. I got injured. I blew my knee out, had 2 knee surgeries. The Navy botched both surgeries. So I ended up getting out and I moved immediately to Colorado. And I was actually on my way to California, back to San Diego, had my truck packed, going to San Diego. My wife at the time was still in DC going to school. And I stopped at my buddy's house in Colorado and I never left. Well, I left my buddy's house, but I never left Colorado. Ended up staying there for 12 years, 12, 13 years in Colorado. And then eventually made my way to Minnesota. And been Minnesota for the last few years. And I absolutely love it out here. A little cold during the winters, but I absolutely love it out here. And in the midst of all of that, when I moved to Colorado, I worked in big tech. I worked for a very large company. I managed 22 international and domestic airports on the circuit level to end user IT level. After that, got out, worked for a cybersecurity company as their chief operating officer, got left there and started doing high level business consulting, um, mergers and acquisitions, all different types of things. And then kind of started my own thing. I wanted to start my own brand. I wanted to be my own self. And I started recording podcasts, which nobody's ever heard before. I started doing content that nobody's ever seen before. And then COVID hit. And then once COVID hit, I had a challenge. There was this stuff happening online with people making predictions and then people decoding these predictions. And I was just so disgusted by these people's lack of knowledge and understanding cryptography and hidden messages and symbolism. My buddy's like, well, I challenge it. Go do it yourself. So I did. And immediately when I did that, I went on YouTube. And within the first week, I think I acquired about 30,000 subscribers in just the first week. Then over the next few months, I ended up being about 187,000 subscribers. And then immediately got banned. The channel deleted, all content deleted. Went out there, started again, and got to about 87,000. I had Patreon, Facebook, all of this stuff going, and then I got banned again.
You were
And
having like 10,000 live people on your live, you said at one
oh,
time,
well, and I
easily.
had the 187. It was like I was getting 15, 20,000 people on my live streams. Um, and then I got banned the second time, and I realized that I have to do things differently because I had monetization. That was my source of income. I had left all my old world behind. And overnight, my monetization went away, seized, gone. And I'm like, I need to do things differently. And this is where I've been in cryptocurrency since 2017 and blockchain. I understood that stuff very well. And I realized that it was time to bring about a decentralized nature to my podcast. And that's when I set up decentralized media. And so decentralized media is kind of known today as the Red Pill Project, redpills.tv, Red Pill Project, but it all operates under decentralized media. And the idea of decentralized media is there's no single point of failure. That if they go after you on one platform, they can't go after you on the other platforms. And there's always backups of content. So if something does happen, boom, you just kick right back up and you keep on going. And I've been pretty successful with that model since 2020. In the last 5 years, I built back a lot of my audience, and I realized that it's not how many you have in your audience; it's the quality of your audience. How is your audience integrating into it? And that's one of the big things for me is I don't just broadcast and then not communicate with my audience. I have a private social network and we do live Q&As every Thursday. I'm active on the social network. People can ask me questions, send me direct messages. I'm on X a lot and communicate with people through there, direct messaging. I'm not afraid to make a friend. And I think that that's one thing that people like about me and my audience. But I started doing what I call the unfolding global conspiracy back in 2020. And I have a reputation for number one, being a human encyclopedia, and number two, for being highly accurate on what I'm saying is going to happen. And the reason that is just because over the years, I've met a lot of people who are, from my military days, from my time in Washington, D.C., I know a lot of people and they all talk and communicate and they all say that, hey, this is what's happening. This is what's happening. This is what's going on. You might want to watch this or you might look at this. But also, I have this innate ability to construct a narrative, to watch patterns and how these patterns evolve over time and then formulate a larger structure of something that's going to happen. And from that, I've been able to just look at the world and say, this is what's going to happen next. Buckle up, get ready. And we've
Yeah.
been highly accurate.
And that's the thing that since I started following you, it's only been since fall. I was just absolutely shocked at some of the things that you talked about that actually happened. And and some of them were kind of wild out, but the Jake Sullivan, you talked about Jake. Now here he is he's right at the top of the list about having his security clearance pulled. I never heard of Jake Sullivan. I didn't
Yeah.
know anything about that guy. Nobody ever talked about Jake Sullivan. I mean, you were the first guy that ever mentioned Jake. And I mean, there's multiple others, but there's some other huge things that you're talking about. I mean, including the gold thing. And I mean, I just want more people to know, like, because your insight and has been accurate. I call it
Well,
insight. Like you have a either
yeah,
either either insight through a connection, or you just study the patterns, but somehow you're getting the information.
I'm
And
autistically accurate. I don't know. Artistic. I like that. I'm going to make a new shirt. Artistically accurate. Jake Sullivan. I think that that's a great place to start because when we start looking at what's happened over the last, I mean, at least 15 years, 2010 to present date, when the Obama administration comes in 2008 and into now the current Trump administration, there is a sequence of events that happen over time. And a lot of these events, we can draw different conspiracies. A lot of these events we can look at and we can see criminality. We know this. But Jake Sullivan's an interesting person. Now, Jake Sullivan, if people didn't know, was the national security advisor for Joe Biden, right? If we go back to pre-Donald Trump, so pre-2016, the last position he held before that was the chief of staff, or sorry, he was the chief of staff to Joe Biden. Vice President Biden. He was the chief of staff to Secretary Hillary Clinton, and he was also the national security advisor for Barack Obama. So, number one is from 2008 through all Democrat power structures, Jake Sullivan is either chief of staff or national security advisor to all of these high ranking people. Now, that's kind of like, what's going on here? Right? But then when you start looking at the flow of his position and where he was, so in 2008 to 2010, you see Jake Sullivan in Venezuela overthrowing the Maduro, right? Overthrowing Venezuela. Remember the big events that happened in 2008 to 2010 in Venezuela, then 2010 to 2015. He was one of the prerequisites that went in there and set up all of this. You have the Uranium One scandal. People don't know this. They can research it. Uranium One is a Canadian company. By the way, Justin Trudeau's family owns portions of the company Uranium One. But what was happening is Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, sold off about 28% of all U.S. refined uranium through a Canadian company known as Uranium One to Russia. Now, Russia, on the other hand, was taking that uranium and giving it to Iran for enrichment to develop nuclear power and nuclear weapons. Now, that was being done through proxy through Russia, but Russia knew that they were supposed to give it to Iran, and Hillary Clinton was selling it. And so Hillary Clinton was doing this deal kind of without the authorization of the United States of America, without the president, even though Obama knew. But then on the other side, she was getting large speaking deals and all these other types of kickbacks into the Clinton Foundation. So you have the Uranium One scandal. Now you go into, oh, by the way, the Uranium One scandal. It was Jake Sullivan who was the architect of that between Russia and Iran. He was the head man under the Clinton Secretary of State administration that was negotiating that. Now you get into more deeper things. I mean, obviously, we have the Hillary Clinton email scandal and these types of things. One thing that people don't know about the Hillary Clinton email scandal, and this is the forefront of all my research, is that Hillary Clinton has 30,000 emails that just disappeared. Nobody knows where they are. Nobody can seem to find them. Well, there's a reason why they can't find them. These emails are classified emails, actually beyond classified. They're known as special access programs. And when we're talking about special access programs, we're talking about dark money, military programs, high-level technology. Well, in the investigation, the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community in 2016 was testifying in front of the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Chavez. And he was asked, like, what was in these emails? And the Inspector General says, sir, I can't tell you. They're classified. And Chavez comes back. He's like, I'm the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. I have the highest security clearance in our government. Do we need to go to a SCIF? Can you tell me in a SCIF? And he's like, sir, even if we did, I can't tell you. He goes, my team has the highest security clearances in the government. Even if we tried for a year to find out what was in these projects and they wouldn't tell us because we didn't have a need to know. Finally, we got a summary introduction into these projects and we learned, and I can't tell you, you're going to have to go to them to figure it out. So that's how classified these emails were. And basically, for everybody who doesn't know, what Hillary Clinton was doing is she had a home server that was tied up with her Secretary of State server. So basically a proxy for their Secretary of State server, which is highly illegal, unsecured. Inside of that server, there was metadata. That metadata would run a script every time that she replied or forwarded an email. So if she replied to an email or forwarded an email, a script would run and it would send a carbon copy, a blank carbon copy to a Gmail address. Well, in the investigation, the Horowitz investigation, the IG investigation, they discovered that that email address was a Gmail account. And when they went in there, the login proxy showed IP addresses in China. So anybody who was logging in, watching the emails flow in of what she was sending were in China. Well, the question is what was in those emails? Well, just so happened that every email that Hillary Clinton at that time forwarded or replied to just happened to be special access programs through the Department of Defense, high-level technology, which is unheard of because she should not have been on that email chain in the first place. So, in other words, every email that she forwarded and replied to went to this Gmail address, which was then being viewed by China. which is treason, selling U.S. military secrets, classified information. But the question is how did she get access to those emails? Well, Jake Sullivan, her chief of staff, is the one who had her added on to those email streams. Now, we're starting to think is, well, what was in those emails, right? Well, we actually know what was in those emails. And we can do this through the process of deduction. When Donald Trump's administration comes in, he starts shutting down these various different projects, also called the China Initiative. In 2008, Barack Obama set up a series of different cultural exchange projects with China. One of them was educational exchange projects. These educational exchange projects allowed U.S. universities and professors to go to China, and Chinese universities and professors to come to the United States and have cultural exchange of education. Well, when Donald Trump came into power in 2016, the first thing that he did was a China initiative that was actually ran by Mike Pompeo, probably one of the best things that he did. But the China initiative shut down these 1,000 talent programs that were going on and then arrested 32 college professors at various different universities. I went out there at the time and did my research on all of these 32 college professors. The interesting thing I found is every single one of them had what was either an NSF grant, DoD grant, DOE grant, a NASA grant, or a DARPA grant. Now, these grants are not easy to get, and they're classified grants that fall under special access programs. So in National Science Foundation is usually the cover that they use. The NSF is usually the cover they use for this. And so you look at what they're working on at these universities. They were working on space weapon systems, space propulsion systems, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence. And I said, this is interesting. So then I start to kind of like deep dive that, well, how would China have known? Well, this is where it kicks in, is why were these professors singled out? They were brought over to China to the Wuhan Institute of Technology for cultural educational exchange. And now the US is arresting these people for tax evasion. Well, what was really happening? This is what happened. Those emails that Hillary Clinton was sending over to this Gmail address, these were special access programs that were being released into the university for reverse engineering. And I say reverse engineering because they're exotic technology that we didn't build. Don't know if there's something else out there, aliens, whatever, don't know. But just understand that it was exotic technology that we didn't build, that we were reverse engineering. And Bob Lazar once said that the only way that we're ever going to reverse engineer this technology is to get it into the universities. And this is exactly what happened, is they were moving these special access programs into the universities. They selected a university and a professor to work on these projects. They gave them the special access program grant, and then Hillary Clinton sent that university and professor's information over to China. China comes in, funds that university, takes that professor specifically, brings him over to China, puts a gun against her head, and steals all their research and information. And this is how China advanced their military 40 years within a 10-year span. This is how China is able to compete with us militarily right now, because they were able to bring those professors over to China and steal their research and information. Okay? And we know that, I mean, and if you remember the big case that everybody heard about, because this was during COVID, was Dr. Charles Lieber. Dr. Charles Lieber from Harvard University was working on nanotechnology. Actually, it's called nanomesh arrays. And basically, this is a nanotechnology that latches onto your ACE2 receptors on your cells in your body, and then it allows the triggering, but that triggering mechanism, it captures the ambient infrared energy that is coming out of cellular respiration and then transmits it wirelessly throughout the rest of the body to power other nanotechnology. This is what this guy was working on, right? And he was probably one of the most well-known people out of all the China initiative that got busted. So we have that, Jake Sullivan directly involved. Now you go to 2014.
Okay, so
2004.
now you're still before 2014. Remember you're saying that's still
Well,
way
I'm going back a little
you're kind
bit.
of going back and forth. All right,
So
got it.
the Hillary Clinton emails really started 2010 to 2012, but then culminated in 2016. But
Okay.
so go back to Jake Sullivan. He's the chief of staff for Joe Biden, right?
DP.
Yep, vice president at the time. So where's Joe Biden go? He goes to Ukraine. And you remember the whole quid pro quo with Joe Biden and Ukraine about withholding the $1 billion of USAID for Ukraine? And what do? Right before that, they couped Ukraine within the Maidan massacre. This was set up by Eric Cimarella, which we know of as the whistleblower from Donald Trump's perfect phone call in 2018. John Brennan was directly involved. We have the receipts of the CIA funding this whole situation, but Jake Sullivan was directly there with Samantha Powers and all of these other people, Victoria Nuland, in that configuration. Now, when Joe Biden was there, it was Jake Sullivan who was that negotiation arm between Poroshenko and Joe Biden. In other words, Jake Sullivan was instrumental and critical in overthrowing the old Ukrainian Yanovich of Ukraine and bringing in Poroshenko. Now, what's also interesting is we get into the Ukraine aspect of things, is Joe Biden's son, Devin Archer, John Kerry's stepson are all added to the board of a company called Burisma, right? Burisma is this company. This is what he said. If you don't stop the investigation in the Burisma, then I'm going to withhold the $1 billion. They stopped the Shokin investigation in the Burisma, got shut down. Well, Jake Sullivan just happened to be the guy that introduced Hunter Biden to Burisma. Why? What's going on here? It seems that Jake Sullivan is this intermediary between the intelligence agencies and the political he's the handler for the politicians and the intermediary between the intelligence agencies and the deep state that go out there and communicate and basically set up events that eventually will happen. And so we have the fall of Venezuela, we have Uranium One scandal, we have the Fast and Furious scandal, which he was involved in, we have Ukraine overthrow, the Maidan massacre, we have the 2016 election, which we'll talk about here in a second, we have the 2020 election, which we'll talk about here in a second, and then we have with Joe Biden, we have the overthrow of Brazil, where Bolsonaro lost because of various different computer softwares that were running in that country at that time. We have Libya. Go to Benghazi. I mean, Jake Sullivan was Hillary Clinton's chief of staff at that time, who was running a digital education program in Libya under USAID at the time that Gaddafi got killed and overthrown and then Benghazi happened. But that digital literacy program was nothing more than a proxy of funding for gun running and money laundering and various other types of laundering through Libya into northern Syria to fund ISIS and ISIL to rise up against the Assad regime. And it was Jake Sullivan who was the head honcho who ran that campaign in Libya. Gaddafi got removed by Clinton. We know this. And Benghazi, Ambassador Chris Stevens actually found out what was going on, knew that the CIA was somehow funneling money and guns and munitions through Libya. He called up Hillary Clinton one night and was like, hey, this is what we got going on. This is going to be a huge scandal. We got to figure this out. And he was dead 4 hours later. So we got to put all this together that Jake Sullivan is the linchpin between all of these different events. You go to 2016, the election. Many people don't know this. Hillary Clinton was so confident she was going to win that election. So confident. She's like, Donald Trump doesn't stand a chance. Well, the reason is because they have a system of how they utilize various different network servers and voting machines to take the election. Now, at the time, this wasn't running out of Serbia. This was running out of Eastern Ukraine. And the reason it was running out of Eastern Ukraine is because it had close geo-proximity.
And you know that because of Patrick Byrne, or how do you know that?
So I know the Serbia part and all this other aspect from Patrick Byrne. But I can tell you with the Russian component, what I'm about to tell you right here, this was one of the first things that I was told by people that I know that were in the know. Right? Now, this will make 2016 to 2020 make complete sense for everybody, right? The Democrats had a server sitting in Ukraine at Burisma, the same company that Devin Archer, Hunter Biden, John Kerry's stepson were all on. The same company that Joe Biden protected when the special investigator Shogun in Ukraine was investigating them, trying to shut them down. Now, there's a server in there from the DNC operated by a company called CrowdStrike, which is a cybersecurity company that works primarily with the DNC. This server was this intermediary that ran a program that would spool up virtual machines in the RAM of tabulating machines. All they would need is network access, which, yes, they do have network access, It would spool up virtual machines in the RAM. So forensically, you can't even see this happening because after the virtual machine shuts down, there's no record of it within the computer logs. And what it does is it retabulates all of the votes coming in to whatever candidate they want and puts in fake numbers. So let's say someone plugs in a thumb drive into a tabulator. It comes in with 1,000,000 votes, 600,000 for Trump, 400,000 for Hillary Clinton. That virtual machine would spool up and swap that. And then and it's in the random access memory. So then as that's happening, it swaps it and then it shoots it into the tabulator, which the tabulator believes it's coming directly from the thumb drive, when in actuality, it's coming from this program virtual machine that's running. This is how they did it. And Hillary Clinton knew that they were going to have the election that night. Well, what ended up happening is that server in Ukraine at Burisma got shut down at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on election night 2016. It just went dark. And we see Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump that night going like this, and then all of a sudden Donald Trump takes off at 9 p.m. Now, what happened? Well, from what we gather, is the Russians shut it down. Vladimir Putin shut it down. Now, that means that Donald Trump somehow was communicating with Vladimir Putin, that there was corroboration between the Russians and Trump. Hence why the Mueller investigation came up. Hence why they knew that there was corroboration that Putin was their biggest fear during this time. There was the threat of nuclear war between Clinton and Putin. So this is why they ran with the Mueller investigation. They ran with Crossfire Hurricane, extrapolated it, brought in all the evidence because they knew that there was somehow communication with Russia and Trump.
So they didn't know how, but they knew there was a Russia thing going on, but they just said there has to be. That was just their conclusion. They didn't know exactly. They had no proof, but they just believed so.
That's right. And the one person that they knew was that connection was the national security advisor to Donald Trump, General Michael Flynn. And he was the first target taken out by Crossfire Hurricane because they were hoping by digging into him, they could find that connection directly to Vladimir Putin or to Russia. But the problem is that they're not smart enough to see where that connection was. That they thought that because Flynn was a consultant for RT, Russia Times, and had this one area where he sat next to Putin, that was it. And they were going to find some smoking gun, or they're going to find Russian agents.
One time he sat there at dinner and they had a photo. Yeah.
But unfortunately, that's not how it happened. And that was the trail to take them off. But anyways, doesn't matter how it happened. How do we know that this is confirmed? Well, remember Donald Trump's second impeachment?
The second impeachment hoax? Was that with Pelosi?
This was the perfect phone call when he was talking to new President Zelensky of Ukraine on a phone call. And he said something. And this is the one thing that the Democrats brought up. He said, Mr. Zelensky, President Zelensky, do you have the server? You know, Burisma, CrowdStrike. I'd like my Department of Justice to take a look at it. That was it. That was the reason they impeached him for that phone call. Do you have the server? You know, Burisma, CrowdStrike. What? Confirms everything that I was just talking about of what happened in 2016, because if he got that server, he would see the IP access logs from CrowdStrike, the spooling up of virtual servers in RAM connected directly to the networking of various different tabulators in the United States, showing rampant election fraud. And they couldn't allow that to happen, so they impeached him again for it. Okay? So, and who was that mastermind? Jake Sullivan was running behind this because it's the same thing that happened with all of this. Okay, so we have that. So now 2020, they have to take Donald Trump down. They can't allow Donald Trump to have another term.
So before you go to that, so you now at this point you're blowing up right on YouTube, and I guess you're probably talking about all this, right? You know, you're starting to just really excel, and you got 186,000 subscribers, right? So, and now you're saying, you know what? Trump's not going to win. He's not going to win this. Is that true?
I got.
Was that like right around that time, and then you got kicked off, or like where was this connection?
So I got banned right before the 2020 election. I lost some of my accounts. We came back, and I had a really strong following at that time. But after the 2020 election, 50, 60% of my audience just left. And all because I said this: Donald Trump's not going to be president in 2020, 2021. That there's no way he's going to come back from this. This was a coup. They won this part. Now it's part of what I said the plan is the next 4 years. And I talked about how the next 4 years are going to be a honeypotting operation on the deep state. And nobody wanted to believe it. They're all like, oh, he's going to be the 19th president inaugurated on April 3rd and all this stuff. And I'm like, no, whoever's telling you that is bullshit. They're lying to you. They don't know what they're talking about. It's not going to happen. I ended up being right, but people wanted to create fantasies of devolution or fantasies that Donald Trump was still commander in chief and all this stuff. And just a little point to that for anybody out there who wants to believe that. If that was true, if Donald Trump was still commander in chief for the last 4 years, okay, that means that Donald Trump is responsible for vaccinating the entire military, including the Space Force. That means that Donald Trump is completely responsible for all those people that got kicked out of the military for refusing the vaccine. That means that Donald Trump is completely responsible for the 23 million people over 4 years that came over the southern border. Rationalize that. Does that make any sense?
No.
No, not one bit. But people have a hard time seeing this. Now, did Donald Trump have connections with the military? Oh, yeah. Was Donald Trump have loyalty within the military? Absolutely, he did. Right? And that if he went like that, things would have happened. But it never got to that point where I don't think he needed to. But also, I want people to understand is that there's a special player in all of this. And the Jake Sullivan stuff, just understand that that's going to probably be the first arrest. That's the string that when you pull it, unravels the complete deep state. Now we go to the Trump administration. There's a certain player in the Trump administration that plays a critical role in all of this. And I want people to see this because
the current administration,
he's coming into the current administration. He hasn't been confirmed yet. But he was in 2016. He was a military general. He is the military general that Donald Trump brought in, hired to defeat ISIS. And within 6 weeks, he completely annihilated the whole entire ISIS caliphate. He was the head of Special Operations Command within Syria and Afghanistan. His name was at the time Lieutenant General Raisin Dan Cain. If anybody has ever heard Donald Trump's rallies, he'd be like, Raisin Dan Cain. That is probably one of the most important figures in the Donald Trump administration that nobody knows about. And I'm going to tell you why. 2018, after he leaves the head of Special Operations Forces Command in the Middle East, he goes to the Pentagon. And at the Pentagon, he becomes the head military liaison to operate all special access programs in the United States military. This means that this guy controls the funding for all special access programs, SAP and CAP programs, USAP programs. He's read into every single SAP, CAP, and USAP program. And he can create SAP, USAP, and CAP programs. Okay? Now, this is one of Donald Trump's trusted generals who's now in control of all special access programs
in the 2016 administration, right? So
that's yes. This is 2018.
Okay, 18. Got it.
So number one is go back to all that stuff I was talking about with technology and all that. There's the reason why he was put in that place. He's got to stop the leaking of classified information, of classified technology out. But also, this guy has the ability to create special access programs. And a special access program can be created by a member of Congress, can be created by a general, it can be created by a president. And so in 2020, he was still head of that office. Now, what I want people to see is that when Donald Trump's leaving in late December, he has Sidney Powell, General Flynn, Patrick Byrne, Mike Lindell, all there, and they're talking about Insurrection Act and doing all these things. And he says, sure, let's do it. He assigns Sidney Powell as a special prosecutor to go investigate this. The next day, all of their credentials are pulled, and it's all over.
Whose credentials?
Sidney Powell's, everybody. So he basically brings them on to investigate this, and then the next day, without telling them, he pulls the rug from them. And nobody knows why. Well, I know why. It's all about misdirection. It's all about sleight of hand. It's all about not allowing your enemy to know what you're doing. It was in this time frame that Donald Trump set up a special access program. This is from what I've gathered. We're about to see the fruits of that over the last 4 years. Now, why? Well, FISA works both ways. Well, who are the only two courts in the world that can issue FISA warrants? You have the FISA court, but then you also have the Judge Advocate General of the United States Army, a two judges that sit in Fort Belvoir in Washington, D.C., in Virginia, that can issue FISA warrants in military campaigns. That's important. It has to be a military campaign. So the devolutionists, they weren't wrong, but they weren't completely right. Is what happened is that there was a intelligence gathering mission created under a special access program with FISA privileges that for the last 4 years monitored, recorded, and watched what the deep state did. They know all their crimes. They know what they did. This is why when Elon Musk comes in and he starts going into Doge and they shut down USAID immediately. This is why they knew exactly where to look. This is why the Democrats tried to stop them from getting access to the Treasury payment system.
Yeah, I mean, just on the USAID, Josh, that seemed to be something that I never heard of, and I don't think a lot of people had ever heard of before. All of a sudden, it comes out of nowhere, and USAID shut down. Like, were you tracking that? Like, can you just give a little background on like the significance of that and like
Yeah.
what the
So I, think about it this way: is we've known for the longest time that USAID is nothing more than a financial extension of the what I call the deep intelligence apparatus. So people are like, it's the CIA. Well, the CIA has definitely grown a lot since the 1960s when they took out JFK, right? That the CIA at its core of when we look at the Langley and everything, this is a shell. And it's very vanilla. But when you extrapolate out of it, when you start talking about non-government organizations, private organizations that intertwine into this network, when you start talking about operatives that are working in the FBI, the Department of Justice, the Department of State, the Department of Defense, that are spread out, this is what we call the deep intelligence apparatus. It's a network that's extended outside of the CIA that is basically the intelligence apparatus for the deep state. And they have expanded out and utilized and taken over a majority of the State Department. So USAID was this black budget fund that they were utilizing to overthrow governments, to run missions around the world, to embezzle money back so give people an idea. They would take USAID money, they would give it to Ukraine. Ukraine that would then put that money into a crypto fund, which was built by the Bank of Ukraine, but the platform operated through a company called FTX.
Yeah, FTX, right? Sam
Right.
Bankman-Fried, yeah.
So Sam Bankman-Fried takes that money in and they hold Bitcoin for the Bank of Ukraine. Their balance sheet doesn't change, but the actual money now gets sent out to Alameda Capital on a loan from Sam Bankman-Fried to himself, to his new company, Alameda Capital, then gets divested into 100 different shell companies who have one owner, a short bio profile, no company information, who all go belly up within a year. Those companies, private organizations, you don't know what they did with the money, but we know we're donating directly to Act Blue.
I just heard about Act Blue and one of the executive orders, I think it was just recently.
Yep. So what we see is this money flows from U.S. taxpayers to Ukraine, from Ukraine into FTX, from FTX to Alameda Capital into 100 different shell companies. Those shell companies then invest that money into Act Blue and then fund Democrat and Republican campaigns. And so this is that loop around that they were trying to hide. Now, I find it highly interesting that Donald Trump, from 2015 to 2025, never once mentioned USAID. Never once did he talk about how corrupt it was. Never once did he talk about how it needs to be shut down. This was the greatest play against the deep state because they thought that they could get away with it and that nobody knew. And then on January 21st, 2025, Donald Trump comes in and immediately shuts down and seizes all funding of USAID, and the Democrats go crazy. Why? Because this is how they were financing their campaigns. This is how they're financing Antifa, Black Lives Matter, all of the various different anti-Israel, pro-Palestine protests. This is how they're financing operations overseas. This is how you're creating various different cartel armies. All of this funding is utilized by the deep intelligence apparatus to bring destabilization to the current system so that they can bring about a global point of destabilization where everything begins to collapse, starting with an economic collapse, moving into World War III, and then the New World Order can come up in its place.
Yeah, and so it sounds like it's a bipartisan or uniparty operation. It's not just one necessarily one party. It's this uniparty deep state. Like,
Oh
yeah,
yeah,
there's a lot of Democrats that were Republicans, but a lot of Republicans too. Like all this, they're all taking the money. And I mean, not all, but a lot of them, right? And they're just involved in this thing. And that's what is being uncovered, it seems like. So
that's right. And so the deep state is not Democrat, even though that's what we hear in the rhetoric. It's Republican, it's Democrat, it's bureaucrat, it's global. It has no party affiliation. It is the uni party. It is the party of one world governments. It is the party of selling out your country, selling out your people for power and for wealth. Um, and it's still going on today, and it's still a threat today. And Donald Trump is making moves right now to kind of curtail a lot of this. Although we are going to, in my opinion, we're going to see some chaos that is going to come about over the span of the next few months and years.
all right. So you got about 10 minutes left. So I'm just thinking, what all right, man. All right, so I'm trying to think of where you're going to go with this, but we're hopefully we're going to be able to do a part two on this because there's so so much freaking to take away from this so far. But where do you see like where we are? Okay, so we talked about 2016, the administration there. Then the whole thing. You went through all the breakdown what happened in 2020. And you get shut down off YouTube for calling it, and people stop following you, you get banned, and then 2020 4 is happening. But now you're back and you're doing the Red Pill Project, right? So you've got your influence is coming back again. But it sounds like you have a ton of connections from all your being an influencer for so long. So I'm just like, where are we at now? And I mean, I know that a lot of people are upset and frustrated, but at the same time, it's like, what is your perspective on things?
Um, where are we at? Currently, where we are at is right about here. So if this is the goal, and this is where we started, we're right about here. We're about halfway through. And what you're about to see over the course of the next 6 months is investigations and prosecutions. So I call that Donald Trump has a three-phase plan. Phase one was follow the money, remove the deep state, put in your own loyalists, right? And then set the stage for everything that happened globally. Stage two is investigations, prosecutions, and building a new foundation and framework for what comes next. Phase three is what comes next. And so, what comes next then? Economically. Number one is Donald Trump economically is not working against China. He's not working against Russia. He's not trying to take out Europe. He is taking down the central banking cartels that operate in this world, what I call the old guard system. This is the old monarchies, the old bloodlines, the central banking system. Everything that he is doing is hurting the central banks. Now, to give people an indication of this, Donald Trump came out today and said that he's talked to Xi Jinping many times in the last few weeks. China comes out and says Donald Trump hasn't talked to us at all. What's
China
going on
or
there?
Xi Jinping said that?
Exactly. Spot on point, right? China says that. Americans haven't talked to us at all. Donald Trump hasn't talked. Donald Trump's like, I've talked to Xi Jinping quite a few times the last few weeks. What's going on with that? He also said he's talked to Vladimir Putin. What's going on with that? In my opinion, they see that a multipolar world is a better foundation for the future of humanity than a one world government. And that the central banking systems is what really is holding back China, Russia, the United States, everybody. It is a slave debt system that needs to be rid of. And I think that what's going on between the US and China is kind of pantomime, if you want to look at it like that. That all it's doing is it's destabilizing the central banking system to put pressure on these countries, which are dropping U.S. treasuries back onto the market. When the U.S. treasuries get put onto the market, that inflates the dollar, lowers purchasing power, gold goes up. And what also happens is the Federal Reserve has to go in there and start buying back those U.S. treasuries, all those debt bonds. And so in two fell swoops, number one, the New York Stock Exchange, since Donald Trump has come in, has lost over $10 trillion of value. Well, who pulled their money out of the stock market? Well, it was the central banks of Europe that pulled the majority of their money out of the stock market because they needed liquidity to pay for tariffs. Well, why is that? If people understand how central banks operate, they would understand why trade was so important. Central banks have a bank lending rate that is loaned down to financial institutions. Those financial institutions then loan that money down to various different corporations around the world. For example, if the Saudis want to move $1 billion worth of crude oil from the Middle East to the United States, the Saudis want that $1 billion now. They want that $1 billion today. But the companies that are purchasing it, that has to come into port. It has to get distributed on tankers and trains throughout the country. It has to go to a refinery, get refined, get turned into gasoline, then distributed across the country again, sent to the pumps, and then pumped into the car before they get paid. So they don't have $1 billion of liquidity to keep that system going every week. So what happens is they take a short interim loan from financial institutions that is loaned down from central banks. And that loan rate matters because it dictates the price of transportation, the cost of product that is going across the country, that is going to get distributed. So if someone comes in and starts saying, hey, I'm going to increase the amount of tariffs that are going, when you bring that ship into port, I'm going to increase the tariffs on that, that cost skyrockets. Now that company A in the United States that's going to buy it from the Saudis has to finance more money from that. So the central banks need more liquidity in order to do this. So they pulled that out of US tech stocks, out of US stocks, pulled it back to the central banks in Europe. Okay. And then China dumps US debt back on the market. Well, Donald Trump in 3 months single-handedly repatriated almost all US debt bonds and debt back to the United States of America. It's now in the hands of the Federal Reserve. And secondly, he repatriated American stocks back into the hands of Americans and not in the hands of foreign nationals or foreign countries.
They didn't buy it. They didn't buy it back. The foreigners.
Nope. Been primarily American financial institutions that have bought back a lot of those stocks, and we're still down, I think, almost $9 trillion on the market value. So what we have to see here is that this tariff move is collapsing this central banking system. Because as a friend of mine says, is gold shall destroy the Fed. Gold has skyrocketed up to over $3,500 an ounce. Donald Trump set up the strategic Bitcoin reserve as well as the sovereign wealth fund. These are part of the new financial system. If people are familiar with the IMF and how the IMF utilizes the SDR bucket, a bucket of various different currencies that operate to stabilize interest rates. This is what Donald Trump is going to do with the sovereign wealth fund and the Bitcoin strategic reserve, is that our currency, which is now the Federal Reserve note, is going to be backed upon the assets held within the strategic Bitcoin reserve and the sovereign wealth fund, which the sovereign wealth fund will hold US gold, and gold is skyrocketing in value, which now the currency is backed upon assets. And people are like, well, what other assets? Well, trillions of dollars in investment capital coming into Abilene, Texas for quantum computing, artificial intelligence. Donald Trump has negotiated the US government is going to get a certain percentage of all profits derived from the patents created from that process, which will go into the sovereign wealth fund. You have all of the oil and gas being mined out of the United States of America, that the U.S. government is taking a certain portion of that and putting that into the sovereign wealth fund. You have $124 trillion worth of rare earth minerals and metals under our feet right now in the United States of America that Donald Trump is opening federal leases onto over the next year, that all those dividends from that are going to go into the sovereign wealth fund. Right? So when we start seeing all of this asset put into the sovereign wealth fund, and now you have a currency backed upon that, you have a completely different story financially and economically, especially in a multipolar world, which central banks now diffuse. And the reason central banks will diffuse is because, well, gold shall destroy the Fed. In the strategic Bitcoin reserve bill that Congress put into place, which it was meant to codify these in the law, the last part of it states that the Federal Reserve banks will immediately send all gold certificates back to the U.S. Treasury. The U.S. Treasury will issue new gold certificates back to the 12 Federal Reserve banks, and that they will repeg the value from $42 an ounce, which was started at the end of the Bretton Woods Agreement, 1971. $42 an ounce is what we pay for gold, or what the Fed pays for gold from the government. So if the Fed is going to buy gold from the U.S. government, it pays $42 an ounce. It values our gold at $42 an ounce. It's atrocious. But this bill says that we're going to repeg that at current market value. And then we're going to redistribute it back, those gold certificates back to the Federal Reserve banks. But the Federal Reserve banks now must recompensate the Treasury for the change in value. Well, the Federal Reserve doesn't have that. They can't do that. Which means that.
You mean they don't have the certificates?
Well, number one is I don't think they have the liquidity of gold because rehypothecation has been ongoing, but it's not happening to that rate. But also, I don't, like I said, I don't think they have the gold certificates. But if they did have the gold certificates and they sent them in, now they have to make up that $2 trillion difference. Do you think that they're going to accept Federal Reserve notes? No, this is going to be T-bills. Not going to happen. The Fed was not going to be able to fit that bill back to the Treasury. So what becomes a negotiating tactic? Well, we got this national debt of $35 trillion sitting right there, and you can't make clear on your obligations as per our contract of 12 USC. So why don't we just eliminate the U.S. debt? Because who owns the debt at that point? Well, it was repatriated back to the Federal Reserve because China dumped the majority of U.S. treasuries.
So the Fed owns the debt for the more. They own more of the debt now. They're the highest.
Yeah, they're the highest taker of all U.S. debt, which means that Donald Trump is going to have significant leverage over the Federal Reserve to the point where this system will fail. And the new system is being built in the process to replace it.
So he could negotiate basically a term to say, hey, you guys are so in debt over there. If you don't want to make good, then we just, gonna have to let this go. Sorry, buddy. You guys we're gonna default on this debt.
That's right. And so we're looking at de-dollarization. We're looking at the declining dollar prices. And so the lower that it goes, the higher gold's going to go. And so if Donald Trump can actually come into that bill and he can determine that, hey, I want gold pegged at $10,000 an ounce, he can do that on these gold certificates of the Federal Reserve.
So what in that bill right now is in Congress? Is it? I have to check the status on it, but is it?
I haven't seen it. I know it passed. I think it's still in committee. Yeah, I think it's past committee, but it hasn't.
That's serious. That's serious. And is there any hope for the Massey bill, the Federal Reserve Abolition Act? I know that he similar.
Listen, there's a lot of talk out there that Donald Trump can't fire Jerome Powell. Okay, but Congress can.
Yeah, Congress can.
Article 1, Section 2, the United States Constitution, Congress has the right to print coin money and regulate thereof. They've taken that power through 12 USC and given it to the Federal Reserve. Well, Congress has full right to go back and repeal 12 USC.
Yeah.
That's all. All they have to do is repeal 12 USC. One bill, right? In Congress, we declare the repealing of 12 USC. Done. That's it. Signed. Federal Reserve is gone overnight. But they can't do that until a new system's in place. And that's the key, is this is what everything that Donald Trump is setting up on the context of the economics is leading towards, is the removal of the federal income tax and the removal of the Federal Reserve.
Josh, where can people find you, man? This was amazing.
Redpills.tv, redpills.tv. And then once they get there, they'll see two little buttons at the bottom. They can click on those buttons. They can find me all throughout social media and all the ways to support us.
Redpills.tv, everybody. Be sure to follow what Josh is doing and support him. This is a freaking absolute brain dump. Like you freaking went on a flow with us today. So I hope that you're able to come back. Maybe we can do another show in a month or so, and do a part 2 and kind of see where things are at. And our friend over there, our Jake the Snake Sullivan, see what he's up to. Maybe we'll make some progress on him. So
cool, bro. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Josh. It was awesome. Awesome to have you, everybody. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and follow Josh as well. So we'll see you at the top.